There was a time when Snoop Dogg and Suge Knight were on the same side of hip-hop history. Snoop was the superstar. Suge was the man behind the empire. But decades later, everything has changed. Suge Knight is behind bars, serving a long prison sentence, while Snoop Dogg owns the Death Row brand that helped make him famous. And now, with renewed talk surrounding Suge's future, old words are suddenly coming back to haunt Snoop. Because Suge has already made one thing clear from prison: when he comes home, he wants answers. To understand why this matters, you have to understand who Suge Knight was at the height of Death Row Records. In the 1990s, Death Row wasn't just another record label. It was a cultural powerhouse. Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, Tupac Shakur, and other major artists helped turn the label into one of the most influential forces in hip-hop. But behind that success was Suge Knight. He had a reputation for intimidation, confrontation, and controlling the people around him. Stories about his behavior became part of hip-hop mythology, and whether every story was completely accurate or not, one thing was undeniable: people were afraid of Suge Knight. Snoop experienced that environment firsthand. When Doggystyle exploded in 1993, Snoop became one of the biggest stars on the planet. But his success came while Suge controlled Death Row. Money, contracts, business decisions, and the direction of the label were all tied to Suge. Then everything changed. Tupac was murdered in 1996, and Death Row entered a completely different era. The label became surrounded by suspicion, conflict, and financial problems. Snoop eventually decided that he needed out. With help from Master P, Snoop left Death Row and joined No Limit Records. That move changed everything between him and Suge. The former label boss and superstar were no longer partners. They were enemies. Snoop eventually became much more vocal about his experiences at Death Row. He criticized Suge over money, control, and the way he believed Tupac's legacy was being handled. In one famous interview, Snoop went so far as to say that he wanted Suge to remain behind bars. He also compared Suge to a school bully who had finally been challenged. At the time, Snoop was essentially saying something very few people were willing to say publicly: the fear surrounding Suge Knight was gone. But then something unexpected happened. Years later, Snoop changed his position. Instead of continuing the feud, he said he had forgiven Suge. Snoop explained that the two men had sat down for hours and talked through their problems. He described the relationship as something more complicated than simple hatred. According to Snoop, Suge wanted control, while Snoop wanted his own freedom. Eventually, Snoop decided that carrying the anger wasn't worth it. In 2019, he even released a song that served as another public olive branch. For a moment, it looked like the decades-long feud was finally over. But then Suge's legal situation changed the entire equation. Suge was sentenced to 28 years in prison after pleading no contest to voluntary manslaughter in connection with a 2015 hit-and-run that killed Terry Carter. Suddenly, the possibility of Suge returning to the streets seemed extremely distant. And that's when the relationship between the two men became interesting again. Because while Suge was behind bars, Snoop made one of the biggest moves imaginable. He bought Death Row Records. In 2022, Snoop acquired the Death Row brand and trademarks. Think about that for a second. The man who once worked for Suge Knight was now the owner of the brand Suge had helped build. Snoop presented the move as a way to restore the legacy of Death Row and create new opportunities. But from prison, Suge wasn't celebrating. He started attacking Snoop again. In jailhouse interviews, Suge questioned the legitimacy of the deal, demanded to see paperwork, and criticized Snoop's business decisions. He argued that Snoop was trying to recreate something that Suge had already built. And the old rivalry was suddenly alive again. Then Snoop responded. Instead of the forgiveness and reconciliation people had seen years earlier, Snoop went back to attacking Suge publicly. He called him an inmate and dismissed his criticism. No more olive branches. No more peace messages. The old beef was back. And that's where the story gets serious. Because Suge Knight isn't just sitting quietly in prison. He continues to speak publicly through interviews and legal representatives. His lawyers have pursued appeals, and his legal future remains something that fans continue to watch closely. There have also been discussions about sentence credits and future eligibility, although the exact timeline for any release remains a legal matter and shouldn't be confused with an actual release announcement. But there is another reason Suge's voice matters right now. His memoir, Your Pain is My Joy, is scheduled for publication in 2026. And the book promises Suge's perspective on some of the biggest stories surrounding death row, Tupac, and the people who were around him. That means Suge could have a much bigger platform than a prison phone call. He could tell his version of the story to the entire world. And Snoop has no control over what Suge chooses to reveal. Then came the statement that made the entire situation even more uncomfortable. During a prison phone conversation, Suge addressed Snoop directly. His message was essentially this: when he comes home, he wants Snoop to explain himself face to face. And that's why people are paying attention. Because Snoop has spent years criticizing Suge, while knowing there was a massive physical and legal distance between them. But if Suge's circumstances ever change, that distance could become smaller. Snoop owns death row. He has publicly criticized Suge. He has called him an inmate. He has talked about their old conflicts. And Suge has spent years listening from behind bars. Now imagine all of those old statements sitting in the background, while Suge continues fighting his legal battles and preparing to tell his side of the story. That's what makes this more than just another celebrity feud. It's a chapter of hip-hop history that never completely ended. Suge Knight helped build death row into an empire. Snoop Dogg became one of its biggest stars. They separated. They attacked each other. They eventually reconciled. Then Snoop bought the very brand that represented the era they once shared. And now they're fighting again. The biggest question isn't whether Snoop and Suge will exchange another insult. It's what happens if Suge Knight ever gets the opportunity to sit across from Snoop Dogg and settle everything they never finished. Because after more than 3 decades of death row history, one thing is certain: the story of Suge Knight and Snoop Dogg still isn't over.